And that was how to make the elixir of life and holy grail. Next up,
I'm a mortal, your source for all things immortal.
Hi, I'm Bruce Newbold. I am a professor in the School of Earth, Environment, and Society at McMaster University, and I'm essentially a demographer or a population geographer. So I study issues that are related to population type questions, and that could be the movement of people across space. I do a lot of work around immigration, and then sort of some sub areas as well. Population health, for example. I do transportation related work, and more broadly, sort of a mobility type of question, just sort of how we move through our environment and how we engage it, how we look at it, those sorts of questions. But if there's a population piece, I always bring it back to that. Where does the population piece fit into the research that I do?
okay, so our podcast is called I'm Immortal, and we first were looking out for a scientist interview. We were struggling to think how earth science related, but I guess as a demographer, what does the word of immortal or immortality mean to you?
Yeah, I guess I've always thought of it as two different ways, really. One would be sort of the literal sense of that you live forever or have an extended lifespan of some sort. I think there's another piece to immortality, and that's that after we're gone, people recognize the name. And we can sort of look at historical figures to think of that certain people remain immortal. William Shakespeare, for example, long gone, long dead, but we know his name. Albert Einstein, Marie Curie. Those are some of the names that always float up, whether it's science or literature, plays, anything like that, they always float up. And so that's another measure of immortality, I think. So we can do it either way.
So I guess as a follow-up to that, whether as a person or as a name, what do you think about Newbold being immortal?
Probably after I'm gone, there won't be a lot of people that necessarily remember the name. I think we all want to have that sense that we are immortal and that the name is going to live on, and it will live on in family. But in terms of, certainly not Einstein or anything like that. People won't necessarily go, oh yeah, Bruce Newbold, that was a name that, I remember, and I know exactly what he did.
Well, at least you'll be on this podcast. This will be floating somewhere in space at some point.
Good, okay. My own little piece of immortality.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes.
You'll be immortal and I'm immortal. So talking purely about like life extension and longevity technology, do you think it'll be a net positive or a net negative for society, and why or how so?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it's one that I've thought about for a while, and not just because of this podcast at all, because of some of the things that I do and study around population type questions, health. We can think of, well, what would happen? Could we extend our lifespan? And there's certainly the suggestion or the thinking that with modern medicine and continued advances, that instead of saying, oh, we now expect to live to be about 80, that we're going to start easily pushing 100 and maybe even more than that. And there's a good historical precedent for that, because even 100 years ago, our life expectancy was tremendously shorter. We were maybe living 50 years on average. Now, as a Canadian, we tend to live around 80 years. And if you go back 2-3 centuries in time, life expectancy was 20 to 30 years. So an incredibly short period of time. And we've really seen this explosion in terms of our own life expectancy over the past few decades. And there's this expectation that it would continue. In some ways, that's really intriguing, that we can live longer because of medicine, because of changes in how we live, personal physical fitness or activity, better diets, better nutrition, for example. The problem that I have is that just because we live longer doesn't mean that we will be living better for that period of time, or more of our older age years going to be spent in poor health. Maybe limited mobility, limited physical abilities, limited mental capacity. or anything like that. That's what I think we have to be thinking about as we move forward. So it's one thing to say, yes, we can live longer, but are we living longer in good health and able to do all the things that we want to do that we do now, for example?
So ideally, would you prefer life extension to occur in our working age range?
I think right now, not necessarily a life extension in our working age. We probably have enough of that.
Fair enough.
It's that life extension beyond the time period where we work, and that in better health. And that also raises other questions that we can get into, things like, if we live longer after we finished working, do we have the income to support that? The savings to support that. Living is costly.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to do that. And there's another problem that even now, you take a look at the insurance industry, for example, and the old rules was, you live to 80, so you make enough savings, you save enough to get to 80. Now we're talking about savings until you're, assume that you're going to live to 100 and make sure that you save enough for that. And that changes the equation in terms of how much we put away and how quickly we put it away to save for those days.
Okay, so I guess sort of related to this question then, aside from the obvious, I think everyone says, I retire at 65, what other factors contribute to when people sort of decide to settle down and start, I guess, saving for their eventual 80 or, 100 years?
I guess it depends on what you mean by settling down. Is settling down, because certainly if you ask some people, they'd say, oh, that's when I got married and had a family and that sort of thing. When I became an adult, maybe. Now the rule is you need to start saving as soon as you can. And with that expectation, we know how accounting or how savings work. The longer you can save and compound it, the better off you are. You don't win by starting late in life. The other thing that you sort of alluded to there was that maybe we don't retire at 65, that we work beyond that. And more Canadians do that. More and more of us are planning or will work beyond age 65. Some because they need to, and some because they want to. They just love what they do.
Okay, I was gonna say, working longer and longer sounds like equivalent to torture. So I don't know if I'm for that. But moving on to, I guess, your area of expertise, especially one thing I've seen you written a lot about in literature was migration. So before we go into the questions about what happens in the future in terms of migration, what are the main reasons people now move, whether locally or to a different country or whatnot? What are the main reasons that someone decides to, get up and move?
Yeah, and in part, the answer to that question depends upon the geographic scale. So people will move locally, short distances, typically because of housing needs and changing housing needs. Maybe their family or their household unit, it's getting bigger or shrinking. So that means that they have different space needs. Longer distance, whether it's across the country or internationally, the number one reason that people relocate is for jobs, to go to a better job, to improve their economic situation. So it's income, it's a job that they prefer or they want, but it's economic piece that's really driving that relocation.
Mm-hmm. With different geographical locations, like for example, if you live in downtown Toronto, you're in an urban area, it's very unlikely that you're going for hikes in downtown Toronto. So how does different geographical landscapes affect the physical activity that we partake? Is there a certain equation or is it quite random?
Certainly not as specific as an equation. We can't quite put it down to that, but we can talk about human preferences. And it is much easier to go for that hike when you have the accessibility of green space as compared to being in downtown Toronto or Vancouver, where that green space is more limited. It's harder to get to. So it's more that the physical environment that you are in helps to facilitate that movement, that physical activity. It's not to say it's impossible, of course, but there are places that it's easier to engage in those sorts of things.
And just a follow-up question from my own interest. Do you think that, for example, living in downtown Toronto often necessitates that you don't need a car? You can just walk around to places. Could that offset the physical activity that they're missing by living in an urban area?
Yeah, and that's certainly something that we do see, that if people have really good transit options, public transit options, they're probably not going to buy a car or use a car on a regular basis because they can walk to get groceries. There's something we call a 15-minute city, and that's 15 minutes walking from where you live. You've got everything at your disposal, your entertainment, your shopping, and that's your daily grocery needs, for example, as well as some of the higher end goods that you're going to buy. And if we could create that sort of 15-minute city all around, that would be great. We can't, or it's very difficult to do that. And so where you're more likely to find those 15-minute cities are in older, well-developed neighborhoods or areas of cities where you have those sorts of amenities. You're using public transit, you're walking places, your physical fitness or activity is probably going to be higher.
I have a follow-up sort of question to this. My friend was telling me about a documentary they watched on how Canada developed, or I guess a lot of countries. And one thing he pointed out was how cars were so crucial to how we structured our living spaces, how we structured cities. And then you just mentioned this 15-minute sort of, you can walk to any place you need to. So do you think that with longer lives, do you think that we need to have a different type of transportation possibly to support this sort of system? Or do you think cars will sort of always be around, always part of human transportation?
Interesting question. Certainly, as cars came into our daily use, and that was sort of post-World War II era where they really, really took off, our cities became structured in a very different way. They were car-centered, and we still see a lot of that development within our cities. That suburbs are where we shop, where we work, are all very much dependent upon our personal automobile. And it's hard to sort of pull back from that to change it. There's some new developments, public transit sort of on demand that will pick you up where you need to be and drop you off where you want to be. Those are coming now, and we're just starting to see that sort of thing happening. And that maybe is a technology and an ability that starts to change what our cities look like, or at least how they function. But it's going to be hard to get there. There's a lot of other investments that will sort of change it. And maybe that sort of digressed a little bit from your actual question, but it's going to be hard. And I think we're going to remain dependent upon the automobile in a lot of places for quite some time.
So another follow-up. I feel like we're jumping on this question over and over. But with aging populations, they tend to, lose their ability to see. They can no longer drive. They lose that form of personal transportation. It often includes cycling and even walking. So is there a form of transportation in urban and rural areas that could benefit older people?
Certainly something like Uber or Lyft, any sort of ride-sharing technology is going to allow that sort of independence for older adults to stay where they are. Most people want to sort of what's called age in place. They want to remain where they've lived for some time. So that's where you can get ride sharing services that can move people around. And again, there's experiments with that. North of Toronto in Innisfil, they've contracted with Uber to provide some of that local transportation for their population. Rural area or largely rural area. So it does provide that connection.
You mentioned the word or the phrase aging in place or age in place. And we talked about so far locally, but I don't know what the word is for this, but is there a typical life movement, in terms of when people decide to move to a different city or different country, pattern sort of throughout someone's life in terms of where they are located geographically?
Not so much located geographically. The one big regularity, which sort of answers your question, is there's something called an age schedule of migration.
Okay.
And it's sort of, you're most likely to move short, long, incredibly long distances when you're sort of late teens into your early 20s. But you're going to school, you're leaving school, you're going to your first job. It's easy to move. And then after that, your ability to move declines really quickly. Where it picks up again is, around retirement age. Typically, it's been 65. You see a little bit of a bump there as people get to, okay, I'm done work. I can go live where I want to live now. And then the one other place where you see a big movement is amongst the very old. say 80 plus. And those are people that are typically moving into retirement homes, long-term care, or anything like that, because, or maybe with family, because they can't care for themselves or can't live independently anymore.
Hmm. So is there a like in terms of landscape and geography, is there a set amount or like a stereotypical type of landscape that older people tend to move to? Like, for example, do they move to flatter areas? That way there's not a lot of inclined hills, or along the thoughts of that?
No, nothing like that that we've ever seen.
Hmm.
There are different pieces in the literature. There's this idea of aging in place, for example, that I mentioned a moment ago, where people prefer to stay where they've been. And that's probably, where they've raised their own families. They've lived there for an extended period of time, so they want to continue to stay there. There's something called a NORC, a naturally occurring retirement community. And it's just sort of by happenstance almost that there's this group of people, they've lived there for some time, and then they grow old together there. And really, it just means that there hasn't been sort of a movement away from that location. But where you see these NORCs are often places that are really amenity rich. So they might have the shopping, the facilities, but maybe also like the physical environment. It's easy to get out and hike or walk. They have their friends there. They have their community, and that sense of community that keeps them there over an extended period of time. And then the only other thing would be, where is that movement into a retirement type of home for those that can't or can no longer care for themselves completely or live independently.
Okay, this is stepping aside a little bit, but because you mentioned earlier about your interest and your experience, I guess, studying like immigration, one question we had was, does your immigration status, like once you've immigrated somewhere, does your immigration status affect your acceptance of technologies such as life extension? Is there any research on that?
I've never seen anything like that at all. Yeah, I'd have to say no to that. My sense is that it's not going to have an impact at all in terms of your willingness to sort of take on these new measures.
Oh, okay. All right. Then maybe, Sufo, we can jump into these are sort of our speculative questions.
Yep.
Pretty much all the questions of, let's say, life extension has happened. And the first one being, how do you envision, like, let's say we live, I don't know, how long you want, let's say 500 years, right? How do you see sort of the whole global emigration thing happening in terms of where people are moving to?
Even with a shorter lifespan, I think, people will continue to want to go to places where they can be, better off economically. But the other big thing will be people will move and relocate to places where there's amenities, to head to a warm climate where they're on the beach all the time, maybe. That's going to be something. I think, too, if we can live 500 years, now we can talk about sampling, sort of moving around to different places and say, oh, well, I lived in Toronto for 50 years, but now I want to live in, I don't know, Chile or somewhere else. And I'll do that for some 50 years. And then I'm going to go somewhere else. And you could, almost imagine this group of people that are moving around and sampling different locations. I think that would be incredibly interesting to be able to do that, to live and experience and really become part of a local community. Because so often we sort of, as a tourist, pass through places, you skim the surface of what it's like to be there. And it's always that tourist sort of piece that you typically get. But to immerse yourself for an extended period of time, if we've got 500 years, I think that's something that people could really sort of do and be part of. And the technology to live and work in those places, we're going to have that. We have it now. It's just sort of that liberation of being able to do that for an extended period. That would be really interesting to do.
So, for example, if this global population lives significantly longer, from our average 80 to 200, 300, 400 years, can we expect them to migrate to certain areas? Like, for example, I'm somebody who works in a third world country. I save enough money as I'm 200 years old to move to a first world country. Can we expect like a lot of migratory patterns such as that?
Yeah, I think it would just sort of be in part that extension of some of the existing patterns that we see, that people will relocate. there's always the question of the rules and the regulations of who can get in and who's kept out. We hear that all the time. But if we were to say, in addition to we live longer and we have this ability, and we take away the barriers to movement, those rules and regulations around immigration, or again, it's sort of that, I want a different location. I want that different experience. And if that's what sort of life or immortality is, of getting these different experiences, people will do that.
Okay, my question before, because so we kind of asked it too, but specifically to you, Bruce, I was wondering if you had like 50, 100, however many more years, what you would end up going or what you would end up doing. Because on the idea of moving, you said a lot of people move because not just, I guess, to immerse yourself in different cultures, but also for jobs. So I was wondering, you're a demographer, but would you ever, with more years, consider a different profession or moving to a different place?
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of being like a university professor. I have had the ability to live in different places over my career and over my education, and that's been incredibly enriching to be able to do that and spend time in different locations. And it's something I certainly want to do again. To go and live in a place and be part of it. That's an incredibly rich experience. Privileged, yes, for sure, to be able to do that. But it's something that I want to do again. Your next question might be where?
Yep.
I guess, without giving too much away or committing myself too much, a place that I've never been or have only sort of touched on. So Asia, Australia, New Zealand, I think, to spend an extended period of time there would be, again, really exciting, really interesting. But I'm also, I've had a very sort of limited interaction with South America and find that location really interesting. So I could see, wanting to be in I don't know, Santiago or Buenos Aires, for example. I think those would be really interesting cities to be part of for a while.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump into a topic that is a little bit more dark, to say the least. So, under the assumption that life extension technology and therapy may be expensive, because as all new technologies come out, they tend to be expensive. The wealthy tend to get them first. What effect might it have on regarding like the current and future segregation of communities based on economy and like other discrimination factors that we see today?
Yeah, so that's a really sort of loaded and an important question. When we think about that, as you put it, we would see this continued segmentation in society, the haves and the have-nots, those that can afford this sort of technology, those that can't. And so, maybe there's a risk of those that can't afford it, becoming second, third class citizen. Those that can be here on this planet for 500 years, they're going to have a very different perspective than those that are here almost in a transient way if they're here for sort of the standard 80 years. So there's a risk of sort of taking advantage, I guess, of extending the inequality. And oftentimes, what we see is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that could very well just sort of continue that sort of trend.
Well, this is not as loaded, but another issue that if you tell someone about life extension technology, some of the arguments against it, like one of them mentioned like overpopulation and sort of like sustainability. So I guess I feel like this technology, it's not a matter of like if, but when, right? But do you think that Earth is able to like support more people living for extended period of time? Or is there some sort of cap where like life extension technology is not going to benefit us in terms of this?
Yeah, and that's it's a sort of a theoretical question that you're asking in many ways. I think what would happen there if we see life extension technology, what else is sort of happening as part of that? So if we extend our life, are we also extending the period over which we can reproduce ourselves? So where we can actually have children, because right now it's only 40 years or so of our lifespan where we can reproduce ourselves. Would that be extended as well? Even if it was extended, I think people would adjust their fertility, so their reproductive behavior to fit the new reality that I might live 500 years, but my family, the number of children that I have wouldn't necessarily be bigger because of that, because I'm going to assume that they're also going to live 500 years. And maybe we don't want to have care for children or family for that 500 years. You could get into a debate or question around, how well we support our children and that sort of thing. So I don't think necessarily increase the number of children that we have because we live longer. And I base that, as I said, some of my experiences as a demographer and watching how things change. The other process that's at work here is that we're probably going to see peak population in the next 30 years or so, after which global population will decline. So I don't think we're in danger necessarily of overpopulation. We might still run out of resources. That's a different question, but we're not necessarily in danger of an overpopulation just from a sheer number of people in the globe.
Okay, so pretty much we'd reach that 30-year sort of cap, or cap within the next 30 years, regardless if life extension technology comes within that period of time, right?
Well, we'll reach peak population under the current circumstances.
Okay.
So yeah, if all of a sudden, there's sort of a switch that's flicked and some of us can now live longer, that changes the equation. But I'm going to assume there too, fairly quickly, it won't happen as quickly, but fairly quickly, people will change their fertility choices as well. The choice around how big their families are. We know that fertility always takes a little bit longer to change, but it does happen, and people will change that to reflect the new reality.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like just a comment on my side, but in past history, when people would have children at a young age, 18, have a child, and the child would grow up with a relatively similar age to yourself, people tended to live in the same household. So I can see something like that happening with immortality, because eventually when your child is 120 and you're 140, is there really a big difference? It's debatable. So going to a much lighter topic, one that I love talking about, vacations. So like right now, a 1 week trip to Cuba for me is amazing. It's it's actually an extended trip for me. But if we were to live 200, 300 years, like how would vacations change? Would vacations become like the concept you mentioned earlier, sampling?
I think they very well could do that. If we've got more time on this earth, we'll certainly get to or in theory, we can get to a lot more places to do that and spend more time doing it. I guess it depends on, in part, how willing are, wherever we work, to give us a time to do that. We've got more years to vacation. Do we get more vacation each year?
Oh, maybe. Good question.
Maybe not. Do you see what I mean? That we're still limited, or may still be limited, just in terms of the number of days that we can take each year. If we're living to 500 years and 400 of those we've got to work.
Oh my, 400.
And that's a scary thing, to think. Okay, I think extending that lifespan, we've got to be extending that period over which we work as well. And right now, you say, oh, geez, I've got to work for, it's another 350 years until I retire. That's enough to scare a lot of people and say, yeah, I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay, so before we get to some of our concluding questions, I had a little bit of a question regarding willingness to move. I think we discussed it a little bit earlier, but as of now, I know a lot of people aren't willing to relocate. Like, even if they were offered a job that pays better in a different country, they wouldn't be willing to, because, they're comfortable where they are. How can you see this changing or getting worse with the introduction of space travel?
I think space travel will add a whole, if we're able to do that, it adds a whole new dimension. But in part, it's going to be like moving to the frontier. So if you think of, colonial settlement of the Canadian prairies or the U.S. Great Plains, and even now to an extent, well, I won't muddy the waters, that early settlement of a new space like we saw in North America, those were, in a very literal sense, pioneers. They were going into a place that they had very limited support, very removed. And this is a technology piece, of course, from their families, from their support networks. But the same thing would be happening. If we go to colonize Mars, assuming current technology, you're still months away from any, sort of help from Earth, or, you break some equipment on Mars, you're months away from being able to replace it. And that's assuming that it's Mars is where we go. Maybe it's further afield, but it would change. And so you would see whoever moves under those sort of circumstances, they are going to be the ones that are really sort of taking chance and cutting some of the other more earthly ties that they have here because of the relative remoteness of those locations.
So would it be correct to assume that because now, traveling to Mars is a commitment, you're not coming back, you're living there till the day you die. If we were able to extend lives to, again, 500 years, whatever the number is, and we were able to, your commitment to Mars traveling is only 100 years, live there and come back, would you expect to see more people going there and coming back?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption, that if you've got that ability and then it's just 6 months or whatever to get there, that makes it doable. And it's only a fraction of your overall lifespan. And then it goes back to the earlier comments around sort of the sampling piece of, you can sort of pick and choose where you live, where you work, and when. It certainly opens up doors and opportunities with that.
Okay, I have one follow-up question, which is actually very related because you talked about chance, right? And I remember something about like some people think driving is dangerous, but there's some statistic like you have to drive X number of years. There's like hundreds or thousands before you will get into like a serious like accident. But if you do live a long time, the more stuff you do, like the more times you drive, the more times you go to Mars, right? That's a risk. And would you really want, like, my question is, would people really want to risk their now not really finite life, possibly, if aging somehow is no longer a thing? Would they really want to risk these things to have some sort of experience, or would they be really, really protective of the life they have because now it's something that can be taken away, and like death is not guaranteed in that case?
I think, and I'm guessing here, my sense is that people would be more willing to, well,
I stumped him.
yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think you'll see some people and they will jump at the opportunity to do something and explore, try something different, and then there will be others that, there's no way you're going to get me on that ship or plane, anything like that. I'm just not going. I'm going to stay here. But that's the way it's always worked, I think, in part. Unless you're forced to move, you do it by personal choice. And so we're factoring in as humans, we're factoring in, why is my life going to be better, if I move across the country or if I move across the universe? Why is it going to be better? And, the one thing with that extended lifespan, or if I back up a little bit, when we say that people choose to migrate or immigrate, we're making a calculation that they're going to recover the costs of moving. Because when you move a long distance, there's a physical cost, the dollar cost of moving. You've got to pay the movers. You've got to pay to sell a house and buy a house. There's also the social costs of moving, of giving up your family and your friends in a location. And then you have to invest and create those new networks in the destination. And so there's a cost to that. But we say it's easier for somebody that's young to relocate and to move because they've got a longer lifespan, a longer working career over which they can recover the costs. So it's a net benefit to them. And I think you can apply the same thing to, that moving across the universe, that people will continue to make that calculation. And now if I've got 500 years or 400 years to recover the costs of that changes the calculus. And people will say, yes, there is a risk, there is a cost to it, but I've got a long time in order to recover those costs. And it could very well be that it's failed, my relocation fails, and then if I can go back home, great. Then I can go back home and there I'll have the support of family and friends and community. that will help me get reestablished if you can do that. So I think that's all part of the sort of calculus of when we move, and that's going to stay the same later on, just over a different time frame now that we're talking about how we do that accounting.
Okay. I just think it's so funny that after university, not everyone necessarily goes into the workforce. I just imagine maybe a few hundred years from now, people are like, I think I'm just going to take the century off, like just really find myself, right? For like a century. That's crazy.
Yeah, it certainly, the backpacking around Europe, but now it's the backpacking around the universe. And as long as they have the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, they'll be in good shape. But yeah, if you've got that ability to do that, we're still sort of doing the same things. I think some of the milestones would be the same in terms of, leaving school, taking that time off, getting a job, working, retiring, vacations. Those still all figure in here, but it's the timing. Now you've got that elongated time frame over which you can do all of those things. Ultimately, then that increases the number of things that you can do. Hopefully you don't go back. If you live 500 years, hopefully you're not going back to the same vacation spot every single year for 500 years, or you better really like it if you're going to do that. When there's a whole world or a whole universe out there, take advantage of it. And even in our short lifespans right now, take advantage of it.
So if there's one thing you want everybody listening to take away from today, what would it be? Tough question.
Carpe diem. Seize the moment. Take the day.
There we go.
I've benefited from that ability to go to different places and experience different cultures, to take that move, take the risks of doing that, so that at the end of your career, your life, you're not looking back and saying, I wish I had done that. And maybe that sounds facile, but, I think sort of under the current COVID situation right now and the pandemic, it makes us all recognize or realize sort of how small our world can be at times, and this need to be part of a bigger picture and to be interacting in it.
Okay, so on the topic of, I guess, seizing the moment, for people who do want to seize the opportunity to possibly work in this field that you are, right, get involved, it's your type of work, do you have any recommendations for where they can go to, or how to become a demographer such as yourself?
Well, it's through university. Take courses on population, and that could be economics, geography, sociology, for example, to get that experience of what populations do and how they act, just to understand what's going on. And there are graduate programs in demography at some schools, not so many in Canada, but certainly in the US and Europe, that can lead you there. But I didn't necessarily set out to be a demographer. When I started my undergrad career, it was something that sort of built along the way, and I realized, okay, studying a population and understanding how it ages, how it moves, how we go about interacting in our environment, that was a real interesting piece for me.
Okay, well, I don't know if we have a lot of links, but if there was anything we discussed in this episode, will be in the description below. Again, thank you, Bruce, for being on the podcast today, listening to I'm Immortal, your source for all things immortal, and we really appreciate the time you took to interview with us today.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.